Our next speaker is Marcus J Ranum. He's the Chief Security Officer at Tenable Security. It's the company that brought us the NSC scanner. He has been very diligent in the past, been working on a variety of products, including the network flight recorder, the Gauntlet firewall, and a variety of other products. He'll be speaking about cyber war, a matter of logistics and privilege. Let's welcome Marcus J Ranum.
Let me try something here. Cyber war. You guys don't react the way an American audience would. The way an American audience would react is that you'd all reach into your wallets and start throwing money at me. As much as you have. So what I'm going to do is talk about something that's orthogonal to the problem that the previous two speakers were talking about. They were dealing with the problem of existing flaws in your software, mistakes that you've made, and the relationship between the mistakes that you've made and the way that other people use those mistakes against you. Based on the fact that you're aware that there are these kinds of mistakes that can be used against you, the question then becomes, what happens if you extrapolate? Right, so if you know that you're making some mistakes, if you're doing something that's maybe not so good, you leave your car unlocked every so often, you leave the keys in the ignition, your house is unlocked when you're away, it becomes extremely easy to extrapolate and think, well, what would happen if a criminal broke into my house and stole all of my stuff? And then it becomes even easier to extrapolate, well, what happens if well-funded government ninjas who were trying to kill me and had the full resources of a state behind them, what if those kinds of people came after me? And the answer is, what happens if a Hollywood hitman, like the character in The Day of the Jackal, comes after you and decides that he's going to attack you? The answer is pretty simple. You die. Because most of us are not prepared for dealing with those kinds of problems. And so what's going on with cyber war is essentially an extension of that meme. If you're vulnerable to Commoner Garden problems, you can imagine that if a real, well-funded, state-sponsored attacker came after you, your Commoner Garden problems get magnified beyond all possible belief and you die. Probably the background script, you could almost replace this entire talk if you watched Adam Curtis's The Power of Nightmare documentaries that were shown on BBC back in, I guess it would have been about 2008, 2009. I highly recommend them. But the one that you want to watch is you want to watch the third episode of The Power of Nightmares. I know a few of taking notes. Adam Curtis, Power of Nightmares. And in the third episode of The Power of Nightmares, one of the points that Curtis makes, which I thought was absolutely fantastic, is he points out that the reason that terrorism has become such a great way for governments to scare their people into giving up all their rights and to giving increasing control to politicians is because the power of terrorism is in the imagination of the pundit. So if I can sit there and you can imagine flying airplanes into buildings, well, I can imagine flying airplanes into nuclear reactors. And then some other clown says, oh, well, you think that's bad. What if we split the entire planet in half with hydrogen bombs? That would be really horrible. And then someone else says, what if somebody creates a zombie plague in their basement? And it becomes this contest to come up with the most scary possible thing. And the great thing about these scary things is that they don't have to be grounded in reality at all. Right? So what I can do is I can say it's quite clear that we're being fought by cyber criminals and we're losing the battle against cyber criminals, so you can just imagine what the government of Israel or the government of the United States could do to you if they wanted to. Okay, so what? It's also perfectly easy to imagine what would happen if space aliens with vastly superior technology came to the planet Earth and decided to kill us, right? They'd invade Los Angeles and they would be somehow or other beaten by the United States Marine Corps. I've seen that in movies. All right. And of course, you really think, well, if any civilization that was capable of interstellar travel wants to wipe you out, what's going to happen? You're done, right? That's it. They accelerate some piece of rock close to the speed of light and hit you with it, and that's it, right? We're done. So the problem with this whole cyber war thing, I'll get into it, is that there are some aspects of the problem that don't line up. So what I want to do is talk about the aspects of the problem that don't line up and some of the significance of that, and then I'm going to segue into Well, what does it mean for you? What does it mean for those of you who are not paid in full members of the American empire? And some of that may be relative or relevant or interesting. I don't know. We'll see. So first off, one of the things that happens when you're talking about cyber war is that there's this big bucket and everything gets thrown into the same bucket. It's all cyber stuff. So we're going to talk about all the cyber stuff as being the same problem. Now what's happening there? What's happening there is a tremendous conflation of the actual problem, right? Because you're aware of the fact that there's cybercrime and that cybercrime is a real problem. How big a problem is cyber war? We don't really know, right? It doesn't seem to be happening a whole lot, right? It's the same conflation that I made earlier when I was saying, well, you understand about somebody maybe breaking into your house and stealing your flat panel TV. But is that the same problem as professional assassins running around with scope-sighted long guns shooting at you from a mile away? Which one happens more often, right? The flat panel TV. You get the same problem with cyber war. You get the same problem exactly because if you were worried, let's say you were extremely worried about somebody stealing your flat panel TV and your PlayStation, which is a reasonable fear, by the way, okay? And you go to great lengths in order to protect your PlayStation and your flat panel TV. And those great lengths would include you get a big, ugly, mean dog, you improve your perimeter security with motion sensor video cameras and stuff like that. You black out your windows so that somebody can't scan from a distance and figure out which room your PlayStation is in at any given time. Right? Well, while you're doing that, you're actually degrading the sniper with the long rifle's ability to shoot you without even being aware of it. And this is what I would call a negative interaction between these two problems. And so one of the things that happens a great deal when pundits who are talking about cyber war are trying to sell you fear, uncertainty, and doubt is that they neglect the fact that there's interactions, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, between all of the different aspects of the cybersecurity problem. And so what they do is they sell you essentially the fear of space invaders based on the fact that you're aware of the fact that somebody could try to steal your PlayStation, right? It was a very interesting kind of an extension of logic. And what's so fascinating is that in the US, it's worked to the tune of, so far, hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on this cyber war thing. And the real question is it useful? Is it an interesting problem? Is it an interesting problem space that we should be involved in? Are these weapon systems that pay themselves off? And what are the logistical problems inherent in cyber war? So let's talk about some of that. Okay, so we've already talked a little bit about these guys, cyber criminals, right? We all acknowledge that cyber criminals exist, okay? Therefore, space aliens. But we acknowledge that they're cyber criminals. But what's their agenda? First off, they're diffuse. They're profit-driven. They're non-ideological. They're going to go where the money is. They're going to do whatever makes sense. They're going to move quickly. If something ceases to make sense, they're going to move on to something else, right? I have stopped getting emails from Saddam Hussein's relatives asking me to help them move money out of Iraq. I feel kind of disappointed. I thought we'd built up a relationship. But I've stopped getting very many of those. The criminals have moved on to something else. They move on to what works. Right? There's this constant battle of action and reaction in cybercrime. Remember that. That's really critical. Because that constant battle of action and reaction in cybercrime results in a co-evolution between the security community, the victims, and the attackers, in which we're constantly degrading by basically playing against each other's weapon systems. We're constantly trying to degrade their attack tools, and they're constantly trying to bypass our defenses, right? And it comes right back to that same problem of if I'm trying to protect my house so that you can't steal my PlayStation, and if I'm really crazy and go way overboard on it, I'm also sort of protecting myself against the sniper with the long rifle. Right? So we can't really eradicate the cyber criminals. There's going to be more of them all the time. There's good money in it. In fact, I think about it, I look back at my career, and I kind of think I should have joined the other side. I would have done well. Being a cyber criminal is actually much easier than being a defender, right? You know, so, and these guys aren't that original. They're not that brilliant. That's why they get caught, or a lot of them get caught anyway. They rapidly shift to where the money is. Now, let's talk about spies. Spies are a big one. In the US, we're talking about spies a great deal. We're talking about economic espionage. We're talking about the FBI is going on and on and on about spies. Coincidentally, it has something to do with their budget, because they're chartered to worry about spies. And so what they're going to do is they're going to talk about spies a whole lot, and then they're going to get more money from Congress, which is bureaucratic feather bedding, basically. But what's the agenda of a cyber spy? Very important thing that gets ignored during that hop, skip, and jump, right? The spy's activities are a strategic activity. No country that has an espionage program just sort of wakes up on Monday and says, oh, hey, we're going to spy on. I know, let's spy on the Icelanders. They might be up to something. No, right? You have some kind of a strategic geopolitical goal. We're going to conquer Europe. Okay, then we ask, do we want to spy on Iceland, or do we want to spy on Norway, or do we want to spy on the French? Okay, we're going to spy on the French, right? Probably a better place to attack. Although, you know, getting around up to Norway would be a big pain in the neck, right? France isn't so bad, and they surrender quickly. Okay, so that was a bad joke. I love the French, really. They're great with the wines and the cheeses, but and the pâtés. But so the point of worrying about strategic activities is that you see what I did there. I conflated a non-strategic, random, haphazard problem like cyber criminals with a strategic, targeted, focused activity that would be engaged in by a nation state. And it's a lie. It's an immoral, implausible lie to try to convince you that those two things are the same thing. But that's what's going on, a tremendous amount in the cyber war, fear, uncertainty, and doubt cell, right? Because if you think about that, really the analogy is very similar to the difference in the kinds of activities you'd have between a random attacker who drives by and sees your flat panel TV in your window, smashes it in, takes the flat panel TV, and a seriously compensated, strategically operating ninja who's got, you know, money behind them and is willing to take the time to learn where you are and what your daily activities are so that they can shoot you. Okay? Now, the agenda of a spy is to surreptitiously get secrets. Cyber spies don't break into your network and then go, waha, got you, and deface your website on the way out, right? What they want to do is they want to penetrate your network, collect your information, suborn your command and control system, suborn your operators, but they want to own the guy who does your backups. That's really the ideal person to go after. And they want to be doing this as part of a long-term activity, right? And the very long-term nature of this means that it changes a great deal from the criminal activity, which is smash and grab. The criminals really don't care. If they've made their money, they can go. Now, sometimes they might care about coming back. It just depends on whether you're worth coming back for. But the spies assume from the get-go that you're worth coming back for, and they're operating in the 5 to 10 to 15-year-long life cycle, right? So they have a completely different problem. And again, this is one of the places where the folks who are selling you the cyber war, fear, uncertainty, and doubt pitch are lying to you. Because if you're trying to break into someone's network and remain in place so that you can suborn their command and control for 10 or 15 years, you've got a really interesting, fascinating problem. First off, your malware has to be completely different from what the cyber criminals are using, right? Because some guy from Kaspersky comes and dissects something and publishes it, and then suddenly your entire espionage program that you spent 5 years building has just been outed. No, so you can't use that. Which means you have to use something that is not only undetectable, but it's going to remain undetected for 5 or 10 years. Good luck, right? It's an interesting problem, right? And so what's the single best way that I could penetrate one of your networks undetectably with a piece of malware that's going to allow me to remain in place for 5 to 10 years? Huh? Operating system might be good. I would own your CTO. That's it. Your CTO would work for me. Not only do I have strategic in, I can get whatever software I want installed whenever I want it, right? This is how real spies work. Again, I would urge you to do a little research on this. You could read about the Oxford espionage ring that essentially gutted MI5 and MI6 during the 1950s. Kim Philby and Guy Burgess, and I can't remember the other guy's name. But there were a series of spies from Cambridge, yes, and they were all ideological communists, and they got jobs in the intelligence apparatus of the British Secret Service, and they all moved up the bureaucracy, right? They completely sold the entire British espionage system to the KGB. It was absolutely brilliant, exceedingly embarrassing, and remarkably low cost. Right, so that's what you're up against if you're worried about, right? So one of the problems is if you're worried about defending yourself against the sniper with the long rifle and years of marksmanship skills is a whole lot harder than defending yourself against the guy with a brick who's trying to steal your PlayStation. Right, because the motivational structures are completely different, the time horizon on which they operate are completely different, and ostensibly the skills that they're going to use are completely different. Okay, let's talk about the next group, cyber terrorists. First off, these guys don't seem to really exist very much, so we're kind of talking about a hypothetical thing here. We've been hearing about cyber terror is going to be a big problem for a long time, and what do we get? We get things like the government of Estonia's website gets crushed by a denial of service attack that a child should have been able to block. What that says is bad planning, right? It says maybe the Estonian government over-relied on internet for connectivity, right? It says a lot of stuff. But it doesn't say that it was a big state-sponsored kind of thing. I was kind of amused by that whole thing. I mean, if the premise was that the Russians were trying to mess with the Estonians over a statue or something like that. And when the Russians want to mess with you, they send the Third Guards armored. That's pretty much how they do that. It's preceded with a battery of rockets and then heavy artillery and then 600,000 guys in tanks. It works. They don't send packets. It's just not the Russian way. But Vladimir Putin is not into denial of service. You just look at the guy and you can tell he plays at a much higher strategic level than denial of service attacks. Which, by the way, would also tell you that if Vladimir Putin threatens you, you should be much more worried. Okay? But there's a potential for cyber terror. Absolutely. We can see that there's a potential for cyber terror. One of the fascinating things that I see going on in the U.S. ideology, we had the great non-existent cyber war between the U.S. and China that happened in 2010. There wasn't a week that went by without some kind of an article coming out from some FBI or Department of Defense spokesman about Chinese cyber attacks and how the Chinese could launch cyber attacks and bring down the U.S. power grid. This fascinated me because one of the things that was going on in 2010 was that U.S. companies that built the smart grid were trying to bid on a $3 billion program to the Chinese government to sell them a smart grid. And I thought, wow, this is great marketing. When you've got the FBI doing your marketing for you, and they're basically saying, our systems suck, the Chinese could knock them over, don't try to sell those systems to the Chinese. Just a hint, okay? But the idea here is that the targets are going to be some kind of critical infrastructure. And the point of terrorism is that you want to manipulate someone's political process from the outside. You're not a part of it, you're not a parcel of it. In fact, one of the implicit flaws in terrorism generally that most of the terrorists certainly don't want to talk about, but neither do the politicians, is that engaging in terrorism is an admission of defeat. Right? By definition, if you're doing terrorism, you're a loser. Because if you've got the 101st Airborne or the 3rd Guards Armored on your side, you send them. That works better. That's how you really terrorize somebody. You just invade them and stomp them flat. But if you don't have the ability to invade them and stomp them flat, then you try to kill a few hundred or a few thousand or a few dozen of their people here and there with annoying attacks. And you dodge the 101st Airborne or the 3rd Guard Armored or whatever the real weapons that a superpower has. So by definition, if you're engaging in terrorism, you're admitting defeat before you've even started. I don't know why anyone would play this loser game, and I certainly don't know why you'd play it in cyberspace. Right? The reason I wouldn't play that in cyberspace is because people really, yeah, you're going to get some news, okay? So you bring World of Warcraft offline, and a few people are going to hang themselves. But, you delete the Diablo 3, okay? Of course, Blizzard did that well enough anyway. But, you bring Diablo 3 down, it doesn't have as big of an effect as if you sunk that ship out in the harbor there with a big explosive. All right, it'd be all over the news, everybody would be watching, people would be going, whoa, that's scary, right? Fire, death, destruction, that's how terrorism works. So cyber terrorism, I'm not really convinced cyber terrorism is a big problem until you can push cyber terrorism to the point where you can actually cause really interesting physical damage in a more cost-effective way than you could cause physical damage, just doing nasty, bad stuff involving explosives, which is pretty straightforward. Okay, now let's talk about the cyber warriors. The cyber warriors' agenda is to be able to attack, degrade, penetrate the command and control systems of the enemy as an adjunct to some kind of physical military operations. It's called a force multiplier. That's the theory, anyway, right? So what's the hidden assumption in this that the cyber war proponents aren't telling you about? Well, the hidden assumption is you have to have a force to multiply, right? So imagine that the government of Liechtenstein decides that they're going to take the US down. So they build this big cyber war attack, they take down the US, then what? When we drop the 101st Airborne on them, we've got a soldier standing on every square foot of Liechtenstein, right? Okay, so that doesn't work, right? No, so they could bring the entire US to its knees so that there's absolutely nothing. I mean, this is a very fantastic scenario where they bring the entire US electronic infrastructure to its knees, there's absolutely nothing we could do, and then their entire population invades and they take over a small piece of Los Angeles. And the Mexican gangs kill them. Boom. Okay, so that's not so good, right? But the idea, again, is that this is a strategic activity. One of the places where cyber war is being used to confuse you people is in this combination of essentially tactical, practical stuff like cyber crime, which is entirely plausible and entirely practical within its tactical domain, and strategic activities, which have a completely different problem. Strategic activities all have to work on some kind of a long-term plan with some kind of a geopolitical top cover that's going to allow you to accomplish your objectives without fear of retaliation, right? The US is not going to launch a cyber attack on Russia because we know how Mr. Putin works, okay? Russia is probably not going to launch a cyber attack on the United States because they know how our crazy guys work. It's just not, it doesn't make any sense, right? Keep that one in mind because there's only one implication that you can draw from that dynamic that I just outlined, right? The big guys aren't going to attack each other, but the big guys are all talking about that they're spending lots and lots of money on cyber war. So who's going to get attacked? Think about that one. Okay, so the issue here is that cyber war and cyber espionage both require some kind of top cover that allows you to do this without the 3rd Guards Armored or the 101st Airborne coming calling. You have to be able to withstand the legitimate pissed-off retaliation from your target. Otherwise, it's not a really good idea to do it. I could go around and talk all kinds of smack about Mike Tyson, but I have to have a plan for how I'm going to handle it if I happen to be in Las Vegas and I get in an elevator and Mike Tyson is there. Right? The answer is he bites my ear off and beats my head in, right? Unless I've got 16 bodyguards. So if you see me with 16 bodyguards, then I can talk smack about Mike Tyson as long as my bodyguards are always with me. And that's really what's going on. In the case of cyber war, there has to be some kind of a useful, achievable military political objective. Otherwise, what's the point of exploiting all of this force multiplier? Now, I frequently debate this with friends of mine. I do have a few friends. One guy really nailed me well, which is he said, your premise here in arguing against cyber war on the geopolitical logistics is that there must be some kind of a rational plan behind it. And I said, yeah. He said, Iraq, Afghanistan. Obviously, our leaders are not rational. It took me a couple of years to figure out how to respond to that, which is, well, we didn't use cyber war on those guys either, right? We used we used conventional military. That's really the problem, right? The other thing is that you need to have secrecy within your own organization to prevent blowback if you're doing the espionage thing. So one of the problems that if you wanted to hypothesize. I'm not sure I buy this, but if you wanted to hypothesize that the Chinese are actually doing huge numbers of deep penetration operations against the US in order to gather our secrets, then the question is, what's their long-term plan so that 10 or 15 years down the road, that doesn't come out and haunt them again later, right? In the US, we've seen repeatedly, for example, that Israel has stolen all kinds of secrets from us, and we know this. It all comes out in the long run. We find out who the spies were. We find out how the secrets leaked. We find out what the trail was that led that thing outside of our umbrella. And so, again, the problem becomes, how do you keep this stuff from becoming part of the public knowledge over time and then being subject to perfectly legitimate retaliation if you're not, if your target of yesterday is capable of legitimately retaliating against you? Right? And that could be trade barriers, that could be, somebody could go to the UN Security Council, wah, right? Like, that's going to help. But there's stuff that you might be able to do, right? You could bitch at someone. So here's a chart that I put together a couple of years ago. I've been using this chart a lot. It just shows the relationship of the interactions between the different types of players in this cyber war space. And the reason this is important or useful is because it shows you the lie of that they're all really working together, right? And that cyber criminals, therefore cyber war, is a legitimate argument. No, actually not quite, right? See, one of the problems is the cyber criminals, obviously the cyber criminals compete against each other. So what's happening in the cyber criminal space is rapid coevolution. As fast as I come up with some new cybercrime tool, someone else is going to go, hey, that's a good idea, and they might start selling it too, right? If I came up with I can guarantee you, if I came up with a really clever command and control system for botnets and I started selling it commercially, there would be clones of it available on the open market, for a quarter or a tenth or a hundredth of my price extremely quickly, right? Those guys compete against each other. And they're actually the lifeblood of what's keeping cyber war from becoming actually a really issue, because the cyber criminals are pushing the rate of evolution so fast. Cybercrime is evolving on internet time. And the cyber warriors, if they really exist at all, are sort of evolving on Department of Defense timelines, which, right, the Department of Defense can't make a new jet aircraft in under 25 years for 10 times what it originally cost. And so the whole logistical properties of cyber war versus the cyber criminals is very interesting, right? So we've got this agenda, we've got this agenda misalignment. The other place that we've got an agenda misalignment, we're really seeing this happening to a tremendous degree with the whole Stuxnet, Flame, Dooku, blah, blah, family of pieces of malware, is when you find out about a piece of malware, it essentially allows you to retroactively destroy that piece of malware every place where it exists. There isn't a competent IT security team in the world that has not at least tried to figure out if they've got Stuxnet on their network based on the stuff that's been being published, right? This is obvious. Now here's the part that's interesting. So we find out that Stuxnet has been published. Well, certainly anybody who's got, PLCs and any of these SCADA systems has heard of Stuxnet by now. And they've probably, hopefully they've done something to kind of improve their system security, or at least to look at and reassess their system security. So here's a place where the actions of one set of cyber warriors affect the actions of another set of cyber warriors or cyber spies. Suppose I had gone to the trouble of penetrating somebody's network very deeply as part of some long-term strategic cyber espionage operation, and then the Americans invent and accidentally leak out and publish this Stuxnet thing. What if I used the same kind of command and control system that they did? And now I've got the guys from Kaspersky disassembling Stuxnet code, and of course they're going to find my tool too. And then I'm screwed, because I've just spent all this time building this system, building this infrastructure, getting it in place. It's all covert as hell, and I just got blown as a side effect of somebody else's operation. And this is completely normal in intelligence work, right? This is part of the logistical problem in intelligence work. When you've got multiple intelligence services or multiple intelligence agencies all going after the same project, or target, they've all got their cloaks and their daggers, and they're all stepping on each other's cloaks because they don't know that the other guy's there, right? So yeah, in fact, I once joked that, that obviously one of the reasons why Microsoft Windows is so unstable is because the Mossad trapdoors keep interfering with the KGB trapdoors, keep interfering with the South African secret police trapdoors, and of course the NSA trapdoors really don't like any of that, so they just shut the whole thing down. But you can see that these guys don't have entirely positive interactions. Right? The folks who are the most free in terms of their agenda, the cyber terrorists and the cyber criminals, because they don't depend on anybody else. They have absolutely no logical connections. They don't need any political top cover. They remain relatively unaffected by each other, right? So if you were a cyber terrorist and you were going to take off some country's power grid next week, and somebody in the Russian business network writes a piece of spyware that happens to use the same attack that you were planning on using, okay, your schedule just got screwed up. No big deal, all right? It's much more expensive if what you were doing was engaging in a strategic, long-term, deep penetration operation, and it accidentally got blown by some bunch of hackers at DEF CON. It's kind of a bad thing, right? Which, by the way, I think, whoops, uh-oh, my laptop just went secure. How did I do that? All right. Well, anyway, so there we go. Delayed magic. So here's another problem. When people talk to you about cyber war, and they want all your money, right, as I was implying earlier, what are the defensive strategies against cyber war? If you break it out as a game theory matrix, this is what it looks like. Now, by typical internet security, I mean the stuff that we have available to us, the stuff that people sell, right? Now, here's the great part. The activity in computer security is entirely in the commercial side. There is some activity on the military and espionage side, but they're not working at the same speed as the commercial markets. I'm speaking here as a cyber weapons designer with 25 plus years of experience here, right? There is no super secret special sauce intrusion detection system that the government has got that commercial IDS vendors don't have. And I'm pretty confident about that, because if there was such a thing, someone would tell me how it worked, and we'd have it in our product next month, right? And if we had a great idea, if we had some idea that was absolutely fantastic, nobody else has, we'll sell it to everybody, even the Chinese, for nothing, right? Because we're selling it to the commercial market. And by the way, I think that's a completely moral activity, okay? As a computer security practitioner, my job is to defend everyone's networks, not just mine, but yours. And I don't care what country you come from, I don't care what your skin color is or what your religion is. If you're interested in defending your networks, I'm your huckleberry. If you're interested in attacking networks, again, regardless of who your target is, what country they come from, what religion, race, creed, whatever, my interest is in defeating your attacks. I'm a unilateral defender. I'm always on the side of the victim. I don't care who the victim is. Now, there's some people who wouldn't agree with that. But in my case, what that means is I'm completely morally justified in selling defensive tools to anybody, anywhere, anytime, which means I'm leveling the playing field as much as I possibly can against cyber warriors. That's a big problem, because actually, I have a track record of coming up with good stuff. But there's nothing extra that the defense guys in the military have available to them, except, sure, they can get custom code written, right? They can spend a lot of money with H.B. Gary and have H.B. Gary get Greg Hoagland to write them some cool new piece of spyware that gets outed within a year. Okay, that's great. But there's no magic there, and that's the problem. So when you hear people from the government, I hope your government doesn't start doing this, but ours certainly is they come along and they say, you know, the private sector has to step up about cybersecurity. You should tell them to just go away. Right? Because honestly, you're already limited. You're limited to doing what you can with what you've got. And doing what you can with what you've got against the cyber criminals is the only thing that's politically and morally responsible for you to do. You should not be expected to be doing counterintelligence against the Mossad. You're not paid for that. If you're a bank, your job is not to be protecting yourself against American and Chinese and other government spies. That's what you pay taxes to your government for. That's what government's jobs are. Government's jobs is to screw around at the government level and fight wars with each other and drag all the innocent people into them and blow them up and all that kind of stuff. Your job is to make money, guarding your data, protecting your networks, and doing your thing, right? So when you're working in some corporation and the FBI comes along and says you need to be better prepared to handle Chinese cyber attacks, the answer would be, I would if I had your budget. And if I didn't have to pay you, maybe I'd worry about that. Maybe I'd hire 20,000 people to worry about this stuff too. But since I don't have your budget, why don't you shut the hell up and go do your job? Tell me how it works if you ever do that. I hear waterboarding is fun. Anyway, so So some things jump out at us from the previous game theory analysis, which is that defense's approaches entirely overlap. There really isn't anything else other than counterintelligence, right? By counterintelligence, what I mean there is that you're going to try to go against your opponent's forces. So if I'm worried, and that is a great thing if you got the money and budget, right? So if I'm worried that the Chinese are mounting cyber attacks, what am I going to do? Well, when Chinese students come over here to study computer science, I'm going to see if any of them would like to retire rich and happy to California. And I tell them, why don't you go back to China, get a job working in the government, work in their cyber war stuff. Maybe after a couple of years, you can get promoted, and you can be like a commander in their cyber war stuff. And if you ever get orders that you're going to launch a cyber war against us, we expect you to give us a phone call. It's pretty simple, right? Or maybe just send a coded message to some Gmail account. The swallow flies at midnight, or something like that. This isn't rocket science. This is how real spies work, right? And actually, so in case you haven't figured this out, I'm a little bit of a peacenik. Actually, we peaceniks kind of like espionage, even though it's filthy and underhanded and expensive. It actually makes it harder to fight wars. If everybody knows what everybody else is doing, it becomes more and more difficult for someone to effectively prosecute a war, unless they happen to be the world's only global superpower and very stupid besides, right? Oh well, it was a good theory, right? So that's a problem. Now, here's another problem. This is the stuff that really bothers me. So I'd like to make some mildly political statements. Cyber war cannot and will never be fought entirely over military networks. Right? There is no separation between military networks and civilian networks. The military networks are all tunneled over civilian networks and vice versa. Well, not the other way around. Can you imagine how shitty the internet would be if it was tunneled over military networks? Right? It's actually, the military networks are all tunneled over Quest. That's why they work at all. Right? They're tunneled, actually Verizon and AT&T are tunneled over Quest too. That's why they work at all. But the civilian infrastructure is by definition being placed at risk, because the civilian infrastructure is what the attack is going to have to go over, and it's also going to be part and parcel of any targets. It's impossible, if your military command and control network is tunneled over my civilian data network, it's impossible for you to launch a denial of service attack against the military command and control network without screwing up the hospital up the street that's doing robotic telesurgery, right? And then some guy on a table has a really bad day. And this is called acceptable collateral damage. No, it's not called acceptable collateral damage. One of the things, if you're a budding peacenik, and I hope I could turn this whole room full of people into budding peaceniks, I would strongly urge you to actually read the Geneva Conventions, which is something that we Americans certainly don't do. I've actually read them all many times. They're fascinating, beautiful, brilliantly written documents that are remarkable in their clarity. And one of the things that they say over and over and over again is keep civilians out of it, military boy, right? And what has happened, what you get is you get this consistent, constant pushback from the militarists in which they attempt to redefine what a civilian is. A civilian, well, if they were where our bomb landed, they weren't a civilian, right? Because we were blowing up a military target, and if they were on a military target, they couldn't have been a civilian. Right? That's why we're killing so many insurgents in Afghanistan right now. It's because they happen to be standing where all the military targets are. This is what's going to happen in cyberspace if we're not careful, right? Because consistently what you see from the militarists who are talking about this stuff is that it's your civilian infrastructure that's being placed in the crosshairs. This is the final step of the militarization of everybody that started in the Second World War with area bombing and continued through a very painful 20th century. And now the dividing lines between what is a legitimate target and what is not a legitimate target has been completely erased to the point where you'll see the President of the United States launching drone strikes on a car that may contain a terrorist and blows up a bunch of kids and says, I kid you not, they were probably insurgents too, otherwise they wouldn't have been in that car. I'm not making that up. I really wish I was. But that's the logic that's currently being employed, right? So international law says parties to conflict must at all times distinguish between civilian objectives and military objectives. Attacks may only be directed against military objectives. They may not be directed against civilian objects. Then it goes on to say that in some situations, if your opposing forces situate their military forces adjacent to or in a civilian objective, one, they have committed a war crime, and two, if you still blow it up, or if you still attack that civilian objective, you have also committed a war crime, but it's of lesser severity than theirs. That's actually what the Geneva Conventions say, right? Now, what has happened is, somehow or other, we Americans, in our brilliant marketing, turned that into legitimate collateral damage. We blew it up, well, it was legitimate collateral damage. Obviously, they were hiding behind the dashboard of that car, and that made them a legitimate military target. So you should read that. It's very interesting how that works. So the proportionality doctrine of collateralizing damage against civilian targets is based on Rule 14, launching an attack which may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated, is prohibited, right? Isn't that beautifully clear? It says, leave the damn civilians alone. That's what it says. And so what the militarists say is, well, they might have been military targets, so we blew their asses up. And that's fair. No, it's not. It's a war crime, actually. But so the reason I'm raising all this is not just because I'm a peacenik, but because this is the logic that you're going to have to confront as we go forward into cyberspace. When the militarists start to move into cyberspace, they've already moved into cyberspace. This is the same logic that they're going to apply to justify taking down your networks for whatever reason they want to, right? So we have another one that's been largely ignored is the 1976 Second Protocol of the Geneva Convention. Has a section in it regarding what are called dangerous forces of nature. And it basically says, thou shalt not under any circumstances mess with nuclear reactors, nuclear materials, dams, or anything that could unleash dangerous forces of nature, right? So no matter how you want to read the Second Protocol of the Geneva Convention, Stuxnet was a war crime. They blew up they basically electronically screwed up a centrifuge cascade which was handling uranium hexafluoride, which is exceedingly nasty stuff. Now, of course, nobody was hurt, so it's okay, right? Right? Of course, we'll get back to that, but the problem with this ideology is that the use of main force like this, basically saying, well, we did it anyway, it only works when you're the top dog. It only works when you're the global superpower. And in fact, it only works when there isn't another global superpower that's going to stand against you. Right? The reason that we had this horrible, extremely expensive and wasteful Cold War was basically a dialogue between the Soviet Union bloc and the American bloc as to who was going to control the world. They cast it in terms of a whole bunch of other more complicated stuff, but basically it was who was going to get to make the rules and how that was going to get done. And that's basically what's going to wind up happening in cyberspace over the next couple of decades. Now, how do you think that's going to work? All right? So putting this back to this problem of reciprocity. So the US right now has basically said, yeah, we did that Stuxnet stuff, and if you don't like that, you can kiss our asses. That's pretty much what we said, which is really fascinating. Any country that is not going to be entirely in line with US policy objectives should be a little worried by that. Anyone who's a citizen of the United States should be a little bit worried by that as well, because what happens if someday we find ourselves no longer the top dog, right? So the problem with acting like the Roman Empire and going around and saying, we're going to send a legion out and stomp anybody who disagrees with us, is sooner or later, you're not. You become the Italians instead of just being the Roman Empire, and then you have to learn to negotiate, and that's a big problem, right? Because right now the Italians really couldn't do jack to anybody, and fortunately, most of the human beings in the world are rational and forgiving, and they don't blame the Italians for the actions of the Romans a long time ago. But if you talk to some people in Central Europe, they're still angry about things that occurred during the Ottoman invasion. 1500, they're still killing each other over that, right? So that's a big problem. So as an American citizen, I'm really concerned that one of the things that we could be doing is buying ourselves this massive karma debt in the Middle East, in which we've essentially got a lot of people who don't like us because we crapped all over them when we could crap all over them, and then someday they go, oh, you wanted that oil? the price just went up, right? Which is exactly what happened in 1976 when the price of oil zoomed up to 400% because the U.S. supported the Israelis during the Six-Day War. It could happen. So here's the problem, right? The dialogue is entirely one-sided. We're sitting here saying, we're going to do this to you. And when Stuxnet was released and word started to come out about Stuxnet, the reaction from inside the Washington Beltway was really fascinating. There were a lot of comments that basically went to something along this tune of this. So, oh, it saved him a good old-fashioned bombing. That was it. Right? It's basically what we did. We did Stuxnet to you, and you should thank us because otherwise we'd have just killed you. Right? Apparently, these guys haven't heard of diplomacy. Well, actually, we know they haven't heard of diplomacy. Ask the Iraqis. But at the same time that that's going on, we had one of my favorite guys, anonymous Pentagon spokesman, who has been quoted everywhere saying this, which is really fascinating. This quote, if you Google for this quote, it's flipping everywhere. So there was some journalist in some room, someplace, who got this fantastic quote. It was just, I mean, it's brilliant for its stupidity. And he quoted this anonymous Pentagon spokesman, and he just didn't manage to get that guy's name. Right. But here's what's going on, right? This is the voice of naked power. We'll do it to you, but if you even dream about doing it to us, you better wake up and apologize. Right? Which is, by the way, for those of you who like Reservoir Dogs, that was one of the best pieces of dialogue in any movie. I remember Harvey Keitel as Mr. White in the breakfast scene at the beginning of the movie, and the guy's arguing with him, and Keitel suddenly goes cold and says, if you even, the guy says, I could kill you or something, and Keitel says, if you even dream you killed me, you better wake up and apologize. It's brilliant. You know, but that's basically what these guys are doing, except they're not Harvey Keitel. They're nowhere near as cool. They're you know, necklace little bureaucrats who live in a little rat warren in Washington, anonymous Pentagon spokesman. So what's happening is that cyber war has become a weapon of privilege. And there's a couple of other examples that you can see in the world of warfare of what happens when a superpower gets a weapon of privilege, right? Nuclear weapons are another weapon of privilege. Biological weapons are another weapon of privilege. I hope I'm not breaking anyone's balloon of cynicism here, but the Soviet Union had a very, very elaborate bioweapons program during the Cold War. So did the United States, right? Of course, we were perfectly willing to blow the snot out of Iraq for not even having weapons of mass destruction, but not being able to prove to us that they didn't. But don't you even dream of trying that to us. Because, of course, we've got nuclear weapons. We've got exactly the same dynamic. In fact, one of the reasons why the Middle East is such an inherently unjust, unstable, horrible, evil place is because you've got a set of superpowers that are trying to preserve a nuclear monopoly from an undeclared nuclear state that, in fact, has proliferated nuclear weapons. I don't know if you know this, but the Israelis taught the South Africans how to build nuclear weapons in exchange for being able to test their neutron bombs off the coast of South Africa. So you've got pariah nations that are out of control that are essentially being treated like they're the global cops because they've got nuclear weapons, okay? Extend this to cyberspace, because this is where it's going, people. Cyberspace is moving in exactly the same direction. Cyberspace is moving into being a U.S.-controlled zone, the U.S. and its favorite nations. And if you don't like it, you're going to be just like Kim.com, right? The United States government is going to reach inside some other country's judicial system, completely change the rules, utterly ignore them, and shut you down and go, well, someone had to do it. Saved you good old-fashioned bombing, right? You should be scared of this. So if you really want to understand the U.S. government's actions in cyberspace, you should think about it this way. Think about it, the United States is acting as if the internet is its colony. It is our subordinate colony. We're going to do whatever we want with it. And just like colonial powers did during the height of the colonial era, if they felt that they needed to change the rules, they would just change the rules. And they go, okay, well, that's the rule today. The rule today is we do what we want. Oh, you don't like that? Okay, well, the rule tomorrow is you're not allowed to complain either. Okay, and that's kind of where this is heading. I'm being a little sarcastic, but that's where a lot of this stuff is heading, right? And you can see this in the way that the United States has basically changed the rules of the internet at the behest of Hollywood, right? There's other countries, and basically the U.S. will go, you know what? We're going to shut your DNS down if you don't do something about these uploading or these file sharing sites that annoy us. We're going to just do that. Now this is cyber war, yeah. But it's cyber war kind of like the way that the British basically held China supine during the Opium Wars and basically raped the hell out of China until eventually actually the Germans rescued the Chinese by starting World War I. But that was kind of an accident, right? It was an accident, but it worked out okay for the Chinese. But otherwise, believe me, you know, if the First World War and the Second World War hadn't happened and caused decolonialism to happen, China would still be completely supine colony of the European powers. Okay? So some things to think about. What does it even mean to survive without the internet? So you got you've only got, well, three options. One option is to just do what the US says. Okay? The second option is to complain a lot, and the third option would be to figure out how to actually respond to this US colonialism in cyberspace. And what does that even look like, right? So the obvious one would be you need your own DNS. You need some kind of a, 10 gigabit FPGA-based DNS rewriter thingamadoodle that you can put at the edge of your network so that if the if the US government and the FBI decide that they're going to shut down your domain names and just unmap you, that it just keeps working, which would be pretty funny, right? The other thing that would be good, by the way, if you really want to make trouble for yourself, if you want to, get smart bombed or something like that, the fun thing, I was daydreaming about this. In fact, if I joined the other side, I would probably build these for the Chinese and sell them, except they'd rip me off because they do that. I don't trust the Chinese government as much as any other government. But picture this for a second. What if you built a DNS rewriterizer that sits on the edge of a national network that allows you to build your nation-centric caching overlay on top of the existing DNS? So that if somebody goes and shuts your DNS off, it just continues to work based on the way that it looked a couple of days ago. But then you could also apply rewriting rules. So one of the fun things I envision for this, and the reason I know I could sell huge amounts of this technology if I was stupid enough to build it, sell it to the Chinese, is, so next time Google complains and says because of government censorship we were thinking of moving Google out of China, China says that's okay, fine, no problem. Oh, by the way, we resold the google.com address space to Baidu. So now when anyone in China goes to Google, it actually takes them to our own service. Kiss my ass. All right, you could do that. Oh, and by the way, all your banner ad revenue now, too, we're reselling that, too. So now when someone goes to Google, they actually get ads from Yahoo. I hope you don't mind, right? Because we can do this with a firewall. This is a simple technical problem. So at a surface level, you could do some really interesting stuff. You could have border firewalls, you could have rewriterizers, you could balkanize the internet, you could take control of this, you could decolonialize yourselves, and you could be independent, because otherwise you're completely supine. So think about that. So the problem, though, is it's less obvious than the first one, is you also really do need your own search engine. I mean, if you remap Google, what are you going to remap it to? Bing? It would cause a revolution. Your people would kill you. Right? So you need to do something else. And then more subtle still, you really need your own entire software stack. So if you're going to try to play in this space, you need your own Microsoft, you need your own Oracle, right? It gets complicated. You need your own Intel. It gets very difficult. This is the reason why this is right now that the internet is a US colony and is probably going to remain a US colony for a very long time. So the first thing that any countries in the world should be doing is trying to figure out how to get some kind of agreements in place that are going to limit US power in cyberspace, because otherwise you've got a big problem, right? So that's my conclusion. It's not a very particularly cheerful one, but we're at the early stage of militarizing this. This is a big problem because a lot of my peers, we've done well financially for ourselves. We've had interesting lives. We've been able to fight the good fight fighting the cyber criminals, and that's legitimate, right? Those guys are somewhat nasty. They annoy us. They break into people's houses and steal PlayStation, the equivalent of doing this, extremely annoying stuff. They pissed my grandmother off. Okay, we can fight those guys legitimately, but we're up against bigger powers than the cyber criminals now. We're up against people who have the powers to make their own laws, right? They will ignore the laws because they have the power to make their own laws, and that's what we're going to be up against. And what kind of example are security practitioners going to set? Are we going to become the helpless lapdogs of this oligarchy that is going? Are we going to become the useless, flaccid minions of Microsoft, or are we going to try to do something else? How are we going to deal with this problem? I don't have the answers for that, but you should be thinking about that. The only thing that works, just remember this, the only thing that works is that the only way to stay morally crystal clear is to always stay on the defensive. As soon as you start going on the offensive, you're compromising yourself. You're running the risk that you're going to attack the wrong person. And that's actually the intellectual basis behind all of the arguments in the Geneva Conventions regarding not targeting civilians, right? Because as long as the only guys you're blowing up are guys who are pointing guns at you and wearing a uniform, then you're probably okay. You can say, he was on the other side. It's what we're doing, right? But the minute that you decide that you're going to blow up a building and everybody in it, you've compromised yourself, and now you're in this position where you're trying to ratchet your way back out. And that's kind of where we are with cyberspace right now. So that's kind of a depressing thought to end on, but I'm afraid that's kind of my nature. So sorry about that. I guess let me give you a cheerful thought. So the cheerful thought is that all the stuff that you're doing to protect yourself and your organization against cybercrime is exactly what you should be doing, because it's the only sensible thing that you can do. Okay. Do we have time for questions, or should I run away? Short question, if anybody's got one. Any questions? No? Good. Okay, well, thank you very much.